Thank you, Ms Miller. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, as others have said, and indeed I also concur in others in thanking the member for the City of Durham for securing this debate. And indeed, I also thank Ash for providing a briefing. I'm conscious that most of this debate and this documentation relates to England. There are some aspects that do apply to Scotland, and indeed, I hope they will be replicated there, and will do my best to try and encourage some action to be taken, because some actions are cross-border, if not universal, and it's from that perspective that I'm coming. As others have said, and indeed confessed to, I don't smoke, I never have, and I've discouraged my family from so doing. I come from a generation where youngsters like myself at that stage who were quite interested in sport were berated by the boxer Jim Watt that you would be caught by a right, he'd be caught by a right but never with a fag in his hand. I think Scotland would be a better place if it had similar efforts on alcohol, but we only concentrated on smoking, and there where we come from. But we have made progress from, my childhood in the 60s and 70s, but there is still a considerable distance to travel, especially when we find it rooted in the poorest areas where there already are underlying health vulnerabilities, and indeed in other sections of our society. So there's considerable work still to be done. The question is, what action is to be taken? And indeed, what action is to be taken is not per se because action has to be taken. It's also more about the extent and calibration of the action that's taken. Because where I wish to come from is to ensure that the social progress that we need to make and want to make in tackling smoking and the social ill that it is doesn't come at the cost to other communities or indeed in other aspects that cause harm in our community. And I come to that from my perspective of having served as Justice Secretary in Scotland for 7.5 years and established a serious organised crime task force, because as other speakers have mentioned, there is a link between illegal tobacco and serious organised crime. Not only is there a link between them, but it also travels into other harms that plague our communities. And also into my interlude between parliaments, I chaired the Scottish Anti-Illicit Trade Action Group that sought to bring together all organisations involved in law enforcement and in keeping communities safe at whatever level and whatever jurisdiction, and indeed brought with them in business, because a problem shared is a problem halved. And I think what I want to say is to simply highlight that cost loading has limits. That's not to say there shouldn't be cost limits and cost loading. It's quite correct, I believe, that a polluter pay aspect should be considered. I've certainly argued that as Justice Secretary for Alcohol, and that's been taken. Equally, it's to what extent do we load it? Because I'm no free market capitalist, but I do recognise, indeed, as did Adam Smith, that there requires to be some regulation and that you have to ensure that there's some control over the market, because we know in other aspects of society that if you close down supply, then you can find that it will simply result in aspects coming around in other ways. And that's why I'm here, not to make special pleading for big tobacco. I wouldn't seek to do that. They can fight their own battles. But this does affect on others because, in particular, as was mentioned indeed by the member for Antrim, small grocers are affected. These are people who pay their taxes. They employ staff. They provide for their communities. They work on limited margins, and yet they lose out. Because the tragedy that we face is that people view illicit tobacco as simply being either ripping off big tobacco or even more likely ripping off the taxman. They've no love for either. But the reality isn't that they're ripping off the taxman. The reality is that they're harming their communities. They're harming those who, as I say, pay their taxes, work hard. They're harming their families and indeed their neighbours who work and depend upon employment in these local stores. Whether it's a pop-up Facebook page that you purchase it from or whether it's a white van man coming in. So as I say, action has to be taken, and I support calls for improvement in what we do to tackle illicit trade. I think there's much more that can be done at a governmental level, both sides of the border. But as I say, in terms of this, I do welcome progress, and indeed I fully support the calls of much of what is made here across the board. What I'm simply seeking to try and emphasise is we have to ensure that we get the calibration right. And that means we have to ensure that in seeking to tackle a harm within our communities, that we keep it proportionate, we keep it at a level that will not be counterproductive, because what we do not want to do is to simply make further progress in tackling tobacco, but at the same time result in fueling organised crime, result in other aspects being abused, and therefore it's a matter of balance. But I thank you, Madam Chairman, for the opportunity to speak.